Hey guys, you're with DJ Needon, and I'm going to talk to you about 16 and Pregnant, not the TV show, but about my personal experience of teenage pregnancy. I'm going to back it up a little bit and tell you that as a teenager I was pretty well-rounded. I came from a pretty privileged background, middle-class family. We had a nice little house, a nice little pool and a nice little street and a great little community, and so I had a pretty average, I'll call it, childhood growing up with a fair amount of privilege, not a whole lot of struggle and challenge growing up. In high school, I was a great student. I was told many times by my teachers that I had a lot of potential. It sunk into the degree that I finished on honor roll and was almost voted valedictorian. I missed it by a couple of votes, and something that teachers should never tell you, you missed it by 2 votes. But so I was also very social. I was very popular. I mean, popular enough that enough people voted that I was almost our class's valedictorian. And it was really just because I was involved in a lot of different groups, and I wasn't really prejudiced against any type of person or group of people or clique. I sort of floated and really enjoyed the company of everybody that I went to high school with. So I was just really, social. So it was in my grade 11 year that I started getting involved with a guy who was a few years older. He was already out of high school. We knew each other mainly because we're from a place where everybody knows everybody and you just can't escape that. But, we ran in similar circles and we knew each other, and so we started spending a lot more time together, and he was around a lot. So, I felt like I was a focus for him. I felt like I was important to him pretty early on, and he would do great, grand things for me. One time he was working hours and hours away, like really hours and hours away, and he drove back just to see me, and I was so swept up in that. I never stopped to think, what's this guy who's out of high school doing, making me the center of his world? Like, shouldn't he have other stuff going on in his life? Like, I never countered it with anything like that. I never questioned it. There weren't any, whether that's a valid question or not. I'm just saying I never really stopped and questioned it. It just felt so good to feel like I was at the center of his universe, that I meant that much to him. And so at a certain point in our relationship, I went to him and I told him that I didn't want to have sex. I didn't want to have a physical relationship. And I had a lot of different reasons for that. And I, went into the conversation armed with these reasons. And I thought I was being really reasonable and fair, and that the response was going to be very reasonable and fair, and that he would understand that, here's this guy who said he loved me, so he would understand, he would be compassionate. And he wasn't. He went on a bit of a campaign to make me feel really guilty, and I didn't exactly see it that way then, but he would say things like, well, you say that you love me, but you don't want to do this for me? You don't want to do this with me? Oh, if you don't want to have sex with me, I mean, if you're not getting it here, then you're getting it somewhere else. And that was a big one. He used that a lot. And it worked. It wore me down, and it made me feel really guilty that, I said that I felt that love was about compromise and giving, and I wasn't willing to give, and I was asking for certain things and not willing to give. So I maybe unreasonably equated it to that, and made myself feel really, really guilty. And I, especially with the if you're not getting it here, you're getting it somewhere else thing, I just worked to prove how devoted and loyal I was. That's how it affected me, that I just worked harder to prove how willing I was. So it probably isn't And a big surprise that at 17, I realized that I was pregnant. And when I realized I was pregnant, I knew from the get-go that I was a mother. That was it. There was no option. There was no question. I was going to keep my child. I was a mother from that moment on. No matter what happened in life, I just knew that I was a mother. I immediately defined myself that way. And that made it fairly easy for me. I didn't have that internal struggle that I know a lot of young mothers have, and a lot of young women in much more dire situations have. I didn't have that. So I'm really, I'll just be very clear. I was very fortunate that I didn't have to go through that sort of internal struggle because things, I'm sure, would be very, very different in my life if that had been the case. So, the next thing was telling family and friends, and my family was fantastic. Maybe not initially, but everybody really rallied around to support me. I got a lot of support in the way of clothing and furniture and that sort of thing from my aunts. And if you're watching this, guys, thank you very much, because that effort made all the difference in the world, supporting me in such a practical, real world kind of a way, not by saying anything in particular that, made me feel like everything was going to be okay, but in doing that, you helped me to provide for my child, and I thank you for that from the bottom of my heart. And my grandmother, who is a really enormous part of my life, really big role model for me in my life, was very, very influential during that time. She was so loving of me and completely without conditions and without any judgment. She was very loving and supportive. So I really had great support. My boyfriend, his family was not as supportive. His parents didn't want to admit that I was pregnant, and they were very traditional, fundamentalist sort of religious people, and so to them we were going to hell, and that was literally said openly, that that's where sin leads, and we had sinned. So very different on that side of things, but I personally had a fair bit of support. Being a young parent, though, with all the support in the world, is not easy. You're thrown into this world of responsibility without the training, without the experience, without the benefit of easing into it in the way that most people ease into the responsibilities of life, with a number of years where they get to grow and educate themselves and become independent, autonomous people in their own right, before they start having children. So you don't have the benefit of that, and that really impacts the way that you're able to make decisions in your child's life. And there's the entire aspect of finances too. I mean, as a kid, basically yourself, your earning power, your earning ability is so little, which is part of the problem that I have with 16 and pregnant, that these girls are being paid pretty decently. And that's not the experience of the vast majority of teenage moms. Finances are a really huge part of your life when you're a teenage mom. You're just struggling all the time. For the most part, I'm not going to say everybody, but for the most part, it's really difficult to just keep your head above water, and you're so stressed. And, right after I had my son, I went right out to work. I don't even think my son was 3 months old when I went out to work, and I was 18 years old. It's tough, to say the least, and you just try to make it all work, and including your relationship. I think that we have these preconceived notions or these standards of family, or this idea of what family is, and especially when you're young, for me anyway, being young, I had this impression that I really needed to try to make it work, and I needed to prove to the world that I wasn't some stereotype of a teenage mom, and I was going to make the relationship work, and I was going to work my ass off to financially support my son. And I just wanted to prove to everybody that, the stereotype that we tend to have of teenage parents is not necessarily always the case. And so, that's a pressure all in itself, that you're trying to prove people wrong about you without even knowing that what they think about you to begin with. The impact that it's had on my son to have very young parents and to have us specifically as parents is that, he sees still, but when we were together, he saw just an awful example of what a relationship is and how people communicate and interact, and the role of mom and the role of dad, what those things mean. The example that he's had has not been a good one. And I know that. I can admit that and accept that. And I see that in him a lot, the price that he pays for the decisions that we've made. And he's had to take on way too much responsibility. Having really young parents can often mean that. Again, not always, but it can mean that your kids end up taking on responsibility for things that you're still not, or things that you haven't completely figured out yet. And especially if there are issues in the relationship, then your children end up taking on much more than they should have to. Having said all of that, with all of the challenges and struggles that we've had, all of it makes us who we are. And I don't feel badly about any moment of that. It emotionally moves me sometimes when I talk about it or think about it. And it certainly emotionally moves me when I look at my son and I see, the 14 years behind him and what's ahead for him. But the way that it moves me emotionally is really in recognizing how extraordinary he is as a human being. I would never wish away my son, and he has so much that he's going to bring into this world. I would never go back and do any a little bit differently. What I would say to any young person who's going into this world of sexual relationships, and maybe specifically to young girls, but I definitely don't want to discount young guys from this conversation either. When you're making this decision, there's so much more at stake, and knowing that my son is worth more, I wish sometimes that I could go back and make a different decision for him that would make his life better in some way than it has been. I can't do that. I can't go back and make that kind of a decision. But knowing what I know now and knowing what he deserves in his life, that's not something that I can go back and offer him. And if I had taken a little more time to think about the decisions that I was making, and if I knew what hung in the balance of those decisions, then I probably would have chosen a little differently than I did. And I probably would have been less likely to allow myself to be, manipulated into certain things as well. And I've talked to many young girls at this point. I've done a series of presentations with this, sort of information, just telling my story and my experiences to high school groups. And I've definitely heard back from young girls who feel a lot of pressure to please and, to do things in relationships that they aren't comfortable with, but that they feel obliged to do. In any case, I'm going to wrap up. You might hear this weird sound in the background. We have Peruvian guinea pigs, and they're the oddest things on earth. They really are. So they make this really funny noise, and I think that's probably a good sign that I should wrap it up. Not to mention the fact that this is now almost reaching 15 minutes in length, which is obscene. So anyway, I really thank you for listening. Don't forget to hit subscribe on your way out, and come check me out in all of the places that I am. I look forward to talking to you again really soon.